Okay, everyone. Hello, we are the two members from the FAP-SIG. We are meeting today for new webinar in the series. Today we are with Dr. Daniel Maitland. He is an associate professor and director of clinical training at Bowling Green State University in the Department of Psychology. He is a licensed psychologist in Kentucky, Texas, and Ohio. And Dr. Maitland earned his doctorate in clinical psychology from Western Michigan University in 2015. Dr. Maitland runs the psychotherapy research or study of connection, intimacy, and loneliness prosocial lab at Bowling Green University, which focus on psychotherapy processes and outcomes of therapies anchored in contextual behavioral science, especially FAP. The lab also conducts research on the effects of disruption to interpersonal functioning in domains of mental and physical health. The research group is especially interested in how this research can be applied to promote social justice and enhance the lives of individuals who hold minoritized identities. So, welcome, Dr. Maitland, and thank you so much for accepting this invitation.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to be able to meet with everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Is that okay?
Yeah, and I think that once you show your screen, your camera is going to be deactivated, so you have to press the button for activating your camera.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, it's giving me a lot of options. There we go. All right. And is this looking like it works?
It's again deactivated, so you need to turn it on again.
All right. Is it on
now? It is not. Yeah.
Okay.
Now it's okay.
Fantastic.
Again, so sorry.
I'm sorry. What's going on, Amanda?
It's not working again. It's off. Now it's on.
Okay.
So once
share, it's not working.
When you share the slides. Okay. Now it's deactivated.
Okay.
You have to turn it on again.
All right.
Okay. It's not working, but it's okay. No worries.
All right.
We can see the slide.
Okay. We'll make this work. It may just be a floating voice. I apologize for that. So as Amanda said, my name is Daniel Maitland. I am an associate professor and the director of clinical training at Bowling Green State University. I've been kind of looking at FAP in some capacity since I was a graduate student, and even before that as an undergraduate student. And more recently, I've come to become interested in social connection and that component of FAP. And what this really kind of drives at is where can we increase the impact of our understanding of behavior change and how connection forms, specifically in the therapeutic alliance or relationship, but also in kind of bigger picture. And I think that the argument is pretty easy to anchor in the idea of loneliness. So when we talk about loneliness, what we're talking about is the discrepancy between actual and desired levels of social connection. This is a widespread problem, and it has pretty large impacts on people's physical as well as mental health. Today, we're going to be focusing on the physical health component of that. In 2010, about 1/3 of adults in the United States reported feeling lonely. However, by the year 2020, that number had increased to roughly 60%. These rates really have been impacted by the ongoing COVID pandemic. And this has been true especially for emerging adults. Reflecting this kind of widespread effect, in the United States, our Surgeon General, who's kind of our top medical expert, declared that we're in the midst of a loneliness epidemic. And notably, while loneliness does impact all ages, those individuals that are aged 16 to 30 regularly report being the most lonely, with the average person in this group being lonely. And this is notable because this has been a recent shift. That frequently, when we used to think about loneliness back in the 1990s and before, we were typically looking at geriatric populations, older adults, who were reporting that they were losing mobility and that their friends were dying, and that was driving up the loneliness numbers. Whereas the matriculation to loneliness being very primary, 16 to 30-year-olds, seems to be related to other variables. And I think this is really notably. And the reason that this is notable is that we can kind of start looking at trajectories here of kind of bad outcomes as this age group gets older. So loneliness does predict mortality, and it does so at a rate of smoking 15 cigarettes a day, roughly. And one of the ways that we believe that loneliness impacts mortality may be through cardiovascular disease. This makes sense intuitively. Heart disease remains the leading cause of death in the United States. So these numbers are up, and the question really starts becoming, how does loneliness impact cardiovascular health or cardiovascular disease? What we find is that there's a compelling body of research that has found a relationship between loneliness and cardiovascular disease, or CVD. One meta-analysis suggested that poor relationships predicts a 29% increase in the risk of cardiovascular disease. And this has been replicated across socially isolated individuals, people who don't have interpersonal interactions, as well as individuals who have social interactions but still report being lonely. And this is a notable kind of two-pathway system, and that it really has implications for how we're going to intervene. It kind of implies that there is a subset of people that what we need to do is we need to get them activated, interacting with other people. But for others, what we really need to do is we need to focus on changing how they interact with other people so as to mitigate loneliness, rather than just saying, all right, go out and do stuff. This finding of loneliness in cardiovascular health has been found across methodologically diverse samples. And we find that this does impact that 18 to 25-year-old group in a pretty meaningful way. So we find that high lonely individuals, or individuals who report high levels of loneliness between the age of 18 to 25, report total peripheral resistance levels that are significantly higher than others. And this is the leading cause of increased blood pressure under age 40, and it's linked to cardiovascular disease. And when we look at kind of the far-reaching data on cardiovascular health and loneliness, there seems to be some implication that the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS, has some role here. So just as a quick review, the autonomic nervous system is comprised of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Your sympathetic nervous system is activated during times of mobilization, fight or flight response, whereas the parasympathetic nervous system is that rest and digest reaction that we have, which reduces heart rate and physiological arousal. And one of the mechanisms that kind of helps us understand this is the vagus nerve. This functions as a bit of regulating changes in your heartbeat, as essentially a brake on your sympathetic nervous system. And we can measure this braking mechanism through what's called high heart rate variability, or high frequency heart rate variability, which is sometimes indexed as respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which is a measurement strategy that takes into account our breathing, which impacts your heart rate and the heart rate variability. And when we look at this, we find that both clinical and experimental observations support this idea of the autonomic system, or autonomic nervous system dysfunction, as a key mechanism by which loneliness may increase cardiovascular disease. So an accumulating body of evidence suggests that sympathetic nervous system overactivity may lead to hypertension. Further, it's indicated that both the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system have a role in cardiovascular disease, and that's going to include chronic heart failure, cardiac death, and atrial fibrillation. Sorry, I can't say that word ever. Interventions that modify autonomic nervous system activity do reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. So we do have a little bit of experimental manipulation that would imply a causal relationship between autonomic nervous system activity and cardiovascular disease. And the investigation into the impact of loneliness on autonomic nervous system activity is a little limited, but findings suggest a relationship between activity and social situations that's moderated by loneliness. That is to say that lonely individuals are going to display differences in their parasympathetic nervous system reactivity when exposed to stressors, especially stressors in social situations here. So what these findings together kind of do is they indicate the importance of understanding what's going on in those social situations and the specific behaviors that are associated with those social situations. And this is where some of the more kind of FAP-y research comes in around intimacy. So there's a compelling body of research that looks at the idea that intimacy may help mitigate loneliness in some capacity. That when we look at it, intimacy, which is a close feeling of connection between two people, really is going to explain that emotional loneliness rather than social isolation. Further, we're going to find that intimacy is going to promote healthy autonomic nervous system activity. RSA, that metric of your vagus nerve, has been proposed as a biomarker of neural social functioning by Porges, and this is called the social engagement system. And what we're going to find is that a strong social engagement system is going to adjust behavior through parasympathetic nervous system mechanisms and effectively inhibit that fight or flight response that's associated with the sympathetic nervous system. In contrast, individuals with a weak engagement system or social engagement system are going to have that sympathetic nervous system activity easily activated during social situations, leading them to react with threat responses, even in safe situations. So if we start applying this theory to social connection, it suggests that in response to social interactions, individuals with weak social engagement systems experience overactivation of the sympathetic nervous system, and as a result are going to do things like socially isolate or engage in social interactions without intimacy building behaviors, without vulnerability, and without effective responding. Consequently, these individuals may experience loneliness and the subsequent cardiovascular reactions that are consistent with that maladaptive sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system functioning. We believe that this intimacy process is inherent to FAP. If we look at using your own reaction as a contingent response to reinforced behavior, it has an aspect of vulnerability associated with it. And the interesting thing here is that intimacy is also associated with our intimacy building behaviors as it relates to the nervous system. So higher RSA, which we view as good, is associated with increasing social connection, less effective dysregulation, greater social competency, empathy, the ability to discriminate emotionally salient stimuli. And all of this is going to allow for more effective responding to self-disclosure in addition to a willingness to share more. Additionally, studies have found that positive social interactions have a desirable effect on heart rate variability. So RSA is a consistent predictor of social functioning variables, including empathy towards other, attachment security, positive and higher quality marital interactions, social integration, and higher perceived social support when stressed out. So what we can kind of conclude here is that both from a theory and from an empirical framework, we may start looking at this parasympathetic nervous system reactivity measured through heart rate variability, or RSA, in response to stress, and look at that as it has a direct regulatory impact on social functioning and our ability to engage in intimacy building behaviors, and that this relationship is actually bidirectional. That is to say, that those people who are feeling threatened don't engage in those behaviors, but when we start engaging in those behaviors, we stop feeling threatened. And what this has kind of led me to do is start exploring this in more of a empirical framework. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to present two different studies. The first study is a lab-based study that we kind of view as an analog to FAP in some ways. If you want to look at the logic of that, I'd encourage you to check out Haworth et al.'s 2015 study, where they used a very similar design. We used Art Aaron's original paradigm. But what we did is we looked at the experimental generation of intimacy in a laboratory controlled setting. We had two conditions that participants were randomized to. A control condition where people were asked relatively impersonal questions. So where did you last go on a walk for more than 1 hour? What did you see while you were on that walk? What's your favorite holiday or season? Why? Things like that. As well as an experimental condition where we asked what we could view as intimacy building questions, things that may prompt vulnerability from our participants here. And these questions became increasingly personal, both within and between time points. Essentially what happens is there's 3 sets of questions with 12 questions each in them. So questions 1 through 12 in each set would get increasingly personal. And then set 1 was less personal than set 2, which was less personal than set 3. So by the end of the experiment, I'll give you kind of the start and end points. The starting point was, if you could have dinner with anyone, who would you most want to have dinner with? Kind of asking like, who would you want to spend time with? And then my favorite, most personal question is, if you were to die today without the chance to speak to anyone, what would you most regret not having said yet? Why haven't you said it? So those are going to be questions that pull for responses, and then our research assistants would answer in kind and kind of respond. Participants here were randomly assigned to a condition, and we used a stratified randomization based on loneliness. So we took low loneliness individuals, kind of average loneliness individuals, which we viewed as the mean and within 1 standard deviation, and then high loneliness individuals, which were 1 standard deviation or above on the UCLA loneliness inventory. And the study that I'm presenting, we're currently underpowered. This is a study that we're still recruiting on. I transitioned labs or started a new job in the middle of this, so it took a little time to get it up and running. But I do want to present the preliminary results because I think they're really fascinating. So if we look at this, you can kind of see that there's 3 time points here. So labeled time 1, time 2, and time 3. And then here we have our low loneliness group, our medium loneliness group, and our high loneliness group. And this is RSA, or changes in RSA. So what we did is we took RSA observed during the 15-minute interaction, which would be each time point, and we subtracted that score from a baseline session. So what we're wanting to see here is higher RSA. High RSA is really desirable here. And what you'll see is that low loneliness individuals had higher RSA, or essentially felt more safe during the social interaction, compared to high loneliness individuals who were increasingly feeling maybe unsafe. And this is across conditions. So I collapsed both conditions into each of these just to get an idea of how does loneliness, essentially what's the main effect of loneliness here. When we start looking at the high loneliness individuals, we see kind of an interesting paradigm here, which is despite the fact that loneliness across the board was maybe less predictive of good outcomes, In the kind of threatening condition, we actually have higher RSA, indicating more safety, more sense of connection than in the control condition. And on the one hand, this is really surprising, but on the other, it gives us kind of a better understanding that it does feel really awkward when you're sitting there making small talk with someone and kind of feeling judged, as opposed to think of people responding well with FAP responses. It can bring kind of a more mutual, kind of a sharing more mutual safety. But one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to tease this apart even further. And so what I did is I started looking at interaction effects. Now, our lowest group in the loneliness only had 3 individuals, and they were all in the control group. So what I did here is I collapsed the control group the low loneliness and the medium loneliness group to kind of dichotomize our sample. So the high loneliness is 1 standard deviation above the mean or more. The low loneliness is everyone else. And I looked at this based on an interaction effect of the control group by loneliness compared to the experiment group by loneliness. And here's where I think the study gets really interesting. When we look at our low loneliness control group, they're feeling the best about the interaction. They're feeling safe the whole time. All right, that's that blue line there. When we look at our high loneliness control group, they're kind of feeling all like initially really uncertain, start feeling a little bit safer, and then kind of drop off again as the experiment goes on. And I think that's kind of an interesting dynamic. But the other thing that I think is really interesting is this low loneliness and in the experiment and high loneliness in the experiment, where we kind of see a decrease and a drop. So initially there's a little bit of a reaction in this experimental group, but the low loneliness group starts feeling closer and more connected, whereas the high loneliness group feels connected kind of initially, and then we start seeing less variability and that threat state. So what this kind of talks about, or what this kind of implies, is that maybe there is a little bit of a slow to warm up that we see in high loneliness people, and that it kind of leads to threatening situations as it goes on. It's not the most clear data, and again, I want to be really humble about this. But I think when we look at this, it tells an interesting narrative of this experimental group and this high loneliness group, at the end of the day, feeling less safe than the control group or the low loneliness group across the board, even after 45 minutes of building connection with another person. And I think that's fascinating. Our other experiment, what we did is we looked at an actual FAP study. So this was a multiple baseline investigation of FAP implemented using the awareness, courage, and love conceptualization. So the ACL model inherently targets the intimacy process. That's how CRBs are conceptualized here. It really is argued to be a conceptualization tool rather than an implementation strategy per se. You still engage in contingent responding to CRBs. It's just the CRBs are less idiographic and more grouped together using mid-level terms. Our control condition here was reading a 2-person play, and our thought is that here the participant would take one character in the play, the therapist, which was me, would take the other character, and you would read. And what this did is it increased familiarity without any personal disclosure. So it kind of controlled for time and personal interaction. If you really get into the play, you experience some emotions, but at the same time, there's no exchange of personal information. 3 participants were recruited here based on high levels of loneliness or fear of intimacy. And throughout each session, the participants wore an ECG monitoring their heart rate. And each session was coded using the FAPers, or the FAP rating scale, with each turn of speech linked to RSA during that time period. So we actually had RSA at both the session level as well as the individual turns of speech level. Now, the data here are interesting. Most of the FAP intervention wasn't the most effective, and this study, if you want to read about it, it is published, and so you can look that up more recently. The RSA component of it's under review right now, but it was not the most effective therapy that I've ever done. But what you can see in general is that in the FAP sessions, RSA increased, broadly speaking. You can see some decreases in the last session for one participant, and that kind of makes sense. Ending relationships feels unsafe. But in general, we can kind of see that FAP interventions increased RSA, or at least continued that trend in a meaningful way, which is good. The coding data, there's not really a good way to compare this. There's no statistical analysis that's appropriate in this setting. And we didn't really have a dependent variable that we were looking at. But what I want to kind of highlight is just how this technique can be used. If we view RSA as a way of measuring safety or creating safety, this can give us some sort of objective measurement strategy of the effectiveness of each therapy turn. So again, I'm not going to go too much into the numbers here so much as we have a way of essentially measuring the effectiveness of each therapeutic turn. And these were coded by two experts or two individuals with a lot of experience in FAP. So really kind of a cool way of looking at this. So from a ramification perspective, we kind of want to hold this lightly, but that may be a potential intervention for increasing RSA. And RSA may function as an objective measure of the effectiveness of each therapeutic action, helping facilitate understanding of what constitutes good therapy. We have a lot of ideas of how to train therapist action, but we haven't really measured what makes those actions good. And we can look at like RSA as a way of maybe facilitating that. Our results here really do need to be interpreted with caution. There's a lot of threats to validity. Typically, RSA, when measured, should be measured for longer periods of time and not just 20 seconds of a turn of speech. But in general, I want to suggest this as a possibility. And when we look at these studies combined, we get a lot of interesting future directions. Now, one of the things that I care about as a professor is trying to find ways to fund my research. And we all know at this point that psychotherapy research is really hard to fund. However, if we start looking at health outcomes that are associated with RSA or HRV, such as cardiovascular disease, all of a sudden we have a fundable line of research on FAP that we can really start looking into in more meaningful ways. We can also start implementing measurement of RSA and experimental and naturalistic research to really start understanding what makes an effective response to target behaviors. Does including, I think the terminology was like soft FAP, where you kind of give the person what they ask for, versus the more like really injecting yourself into therapy. And now we may have a way of measuring that. And I think that's indicated. But before we do that, we really need more rigorous investigation into the validity of RSA and HRV in this context. We should be exploring how does it relate to self-reported loneliness, connection, fear of intimacy, all of these variables and these constructs that we care about as FAP researchers. So this is what my lab is thinking about right now, amongst many other things. We're really excited to keep on exploring this through many different avenues. And hopefully we can talk a little bit about this. So I went a little bit over, I apologize for that, but I'd like to use this time to just have a discussion and answer any questions that anyone might have, assuming that you're watching this live and not looking at it later on. So with that said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hopefully y'all can see me again.
Thank you, Daniel. So I'm going to check on the YouTube channel. See, we don't have any questions so far. However, I would like to ask you a little bit about how to collect data regarding the autonomous nervous system in parallel with these intimate and meaningful relationships in a more like, or if you have the, the answer, in a more like control environment and that kind of things, what could be challenges or options to do that kind of things?
Yeah, so in a controlled environment, one of the things that we really need to do is understand how or if we're building relationships or intimacy. So one of the things that I found with running my experiment is that there are big differences in how my RAs respond to people, and bringing themselves into the responses can be really challenging. We always have that kind of baseline concern about it. It also is really artificial. And when you think of it, I always put a disclaimer in my research that essentially says, yeah, you get to like build a close relationship or share hard things with this person in this research setting, but they're not allowed to talk to you afterwards, and they need to not have a relationship with you afterwards. And so I think that sort of implicitly creates a challenge where how much are you going to share if you know that you only have 45 minutes with someone, and then you're never going to talk to them again. Further, being hooked up to electrodes is really, I think, distracting for participants at times. So the way this was done is they would sit close to a computer and they'd have 6 feet of wires connected to 3 electrodes on their chest while they were engaged in this interaction. So I think that there are threats to external validity in that controlled situation. But it also gives you a really good opportunity to understand the connection aspects of it. So there's always that trade-off between internal and external validity.
Yeah.
And then you have to clean the data. Cleaning heart rate data is the worst if you haven't done it yet. So essentially, you go through and you look at each individual heartbeat and find the top of the heartbeat, and then it takes hours. So that is my sharing of cleaning heart rate variability data.
Okay, yeah, it sounds really challenging. And now, like, I'm gonna move to the other part of the external validity, the ecological validity. So, what do you think about more like ecological momentary assessment and wearables for looking at these? What could be challenges on that kind of from that wing of the research for interactions?
Yeah, so this is kind of the thread I'm tugging at right now. I just submitted a grant proposal looking at it. And the challenges that we kind of face are getting people to initiate responses based on their interaction. So when you look at how ecological momentary assessment is done, you can either push surveys to people at increments of time, or you can have participants initiate an event after a social interaction. And there's research that says that they get roughly the same reaction but measure slightly different things. But it's really hard to know for sure that your participants are initiating a reaction after a survey versus if you're incentivizing participation and you're incentivizing responses, are they doing it after the fact? It's always a trade-off. The same thing with if you're doing ambulatory assessment of heart rate variability, you're capturing large periods of time and you don't know what else is going on. Heart rate variability is really sensitive. Sorry, I'm talking really fast. Heart rate variability is really sensitive to things like sleep and caffeine and all of these other things. So there's just a lot of variables to think about controlling, and then not to mention isolating the heart rate during periods of interaction to really get an idea of that. So there are definitely challenges, and it's an imperfect system, but sometimes imperfect is all we have. And I think we have to make the most of that to increase incrementally our understanding of this field.
Mm-hmm. So, if you can think about the future of the research, you put some lines, but something that we really need to do in FAP with this kind of research? What would be the next step?
So I think if I were to look at this, I would want to replicate my findings in more of a group design. And the interesting thing is there's such a limited amount of group design data on FAP, period. But if we were to understand differences and like, is this finding replicable in an N of more than three? I think that would be a first step. And then it's kind of trying to get consistency in the responding. So if you look at the study, the multiple baseline design, I was not effectively responding to CRBs in that study. And instead, what I was doing is I was focusing on the relationship at the cost of focusing on CRBs. So essentially, I was like, you're really brave and you're really great, but it wasn't really contingent responding. So I think we have to have kind of better therapy in the measurement of this. I'll put myself on blast a little bit there. But I think that we can also start thinking about what does this look like when we really control, like, isolation is another thing, is we don't know how isolated these individuals necessarily were. And if we're really hypothesizing two different paths, we really want to focus on that lack of intimacy path rather than the lack of interaction path. So there's a lot of directions I want to take this, but I think, for me, the logical study is I've always wanted to do an RCT of training people to look for CRBs compared to full model FAP. There's a great quote in the 91 book where Bob and Mavis say, all you need is rule 1 to do FAP. I've always wanted to test that out. And I think doing that while people are hooked up to electrodes would be a lot of fun.
Okay, that sounds really fun to do. Well, thank you so much for being here with us, Daniel. I think that you bring a lot of new ideas and developings on FAB and another field to explore, like it's not just in the clinical 101, but also the relevance for health and public health and how to get people in a path that can reduce the chances of uh, get cardiac or heart disease or extreme stress that is really also complicated. Okay, thank you so much for accepting the invitation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here with us, and we wait that this kind of series helping you to see how FAB research is going. Bye.